Dennis, how did you get involved with the Kurtzman family and just getting to know Harvey?
Back in 1969, I self-published my first underground comic called Mom's Homemade Comics #1, and I had the temerity to send a copy to Harvey, and was pleased and surprised to get a very nice handwritten letter back from him, complimentary, encouraging me, and so it started a correspondence. A year or so later, I was teaching a class at a free university, and I had a $500 budget to do whatever I wanted with, and I calculated that I could bring in Harvey Kurtzman for $500. So I did. And so that's when we first met. And we just hit it off. He didn't, I was part of the hippie generation that Jerry Rubin said shouldn't trust anyone over 30, but didn't apply to guys like Harvey. He was, to the underground comic guys, he was part of the group. Somebody called him the father of underground comics, and he corrected us, and he said, no, I prefer to be called a father-in-law of underground comics, which is definitely funnier. But he was a spiritual inspiration. And so it was a thrill to get to know him. And he was a very down-to-earth guy, very generous with his time, with his advice, and very compassionate, humanistic man who happened to be funny. But he worked hard to be funny. It doesn't come easy.
And at the time you started getting to know him, was he conscious of, that, because, obviously it's a shame that he's not here now because the legacy of comics is so much greater, the awareness of comics is so much greater. But did he know what his place in history was? Did he know that he had created man, that he created all these things?
He did intellectually, but he was very modest about it, and he deflected any kind of praise that got too heavy. That he would always have some quick line that, if you said, Harvey, you're amazing, he'd say, yeah, you and my mom think so. But, he wouldn't acknowledge it in a way that he could have. He basically was more interested in what was next. He was, in that way, kind of like Will Eisner. He was less interested in past accomplishments and more what was on the horizon. He was terribly excited about the graphic novel format, for example. For him, everything had been about giving comics respectability and having a format that was itself respectable. He really was embarrassed that comic books were comic books. He wanted them to be books. And nothing pleased him more than when the Europeans and Americans started putting square spines on comics and putting them in nicer paper and dealing with heavier topics. So he looked forward, which I think is all we can expect from someone who showed vision earlier.
Yeah, and you talk about that. Like, same thing with Eisner. I mean, 1974, Eisner did Contract with God, which is considered the first graphic novel. But Jungle Book was 1958. It was published by Ian Ballantine, who founded Ballantine Books, Pocket Books. And Kurtzman conceived that as a, it didn't have a main graphic novel, but he conceived it as a full-length adventure with sub-stories.
Yeah, actually, if those of you who are familiar with both, if you compare Contract with God, which, obviously I think is wonderful, if you compare it to Jungle Book, which was done 25 years earlier, they're virtually identical. They're both books that comprise of 4 short stories, and the difference is Will's came at a time when it revolutionized the comics industry. Harvey's was an utter failure, and Ian Ballantine abandoned him, and he, like too many things in his life, he was ahead of his time, quite literally in this case. And what's even more astonishing is in going through the material, we found he had done a thing that was basically an adaptation of Dickens' Christmas Carol, did a thing called Marley's Ghost. And in going through the correspondence, I'd seen the originals, but they weren't dated. I was astonished to find that he had submitted them to Simon & Schuster in 1954. 1954. So you're going back another 20-some years from when he did even Jungle Book. So clearly, Simon & Schuster and the other publishers he submitted this to didn't have a clue that this was a graphic novel and someday it would be the fastest growing genre in publishing. But back then, they did not. In fact, he couldn't even get to see the editor he wanted to see. He was pawned off on an assistant editor whose name was in the letter, who was giving Harvey a very, like a 2-sentence rejection letter. And it just occurred to me in reading that, if that young kid had been a comics fan, history as we know would have been different. But it wasn't. And so Harvey continued to plod on doing what he was doing. And he got a manner of fame, but he never got the reward he deserved. And he really never got all the accolades he deserved.